Hey everybody, it's Mike. It's Tuesday, November 8th, 2022. I have some Beatle topics, as you can see, that I'm going to take you through. But the first thing I want to do is to thank everybody for the great feedback that was received from the show that I did with Sally, where she presented her discovery and her evidence that Billy has an artificial eye. Between that show and the follow-up show I did with Billy Watson, 60,000 views, so not too shabby. Also, I am way behind in email by about 2 weeks. So if you have emailed me and you have not heard back, it's not because I'm ignoring you or I don't love you. It's just that the queue is very long. And please keep in mind, I cannot respond to every email. I do try to read as many as I possibly can, but it's not physically possible to get back to everyone. Okay, so with that, the table of contents, we're going to talk a little bit more about the eye stuff. And then I'm going to take you through a very interesting interview that John Lennon and Paul McCartney did with the BBC, going back to August 5th, 1966, and that's the date that Revolver was released. And I think you will find this interview intriguing. Then I'm going to play a clip from the Hulu special, McCartney 321, where Rick Rubin is discussing the bass track with Billy. And I think you'll find this to be a very interesting piece of dialogue as well. And then I will take you through why I believe Theodore Adorno wrote the song Piggies, not George Harrison. And then I will move to a chart where I'm going to talk about things to look for or predictions. And then we'll wrap up with the comment policy. I've talked about comments in the past, but I think it's always a good idea to revisit every once in a while so that when folks come here, they understand what the policy is. Okay, so with that, let's move to slide number 2 and let's take a look at some more eye stuff. Okay, so soon after I did the show with Sally, a video came out where Katy Perry was futzing around with her right eye and she was actually pulling her eyelid down. And folks were writing me and asking me if she had an artificial eye, and I said no. What she's doing is blatant, in-your-face, one-eyed symbolism. And just as a reminder, the right eye represents Ra, or the sun, and the left eye represents Horus, or the moon. We will see entertainers and celebrities go both ways with the eyes. Sometimes they will depict the eye of Ra. Other times they will be depicting the eye of Horus. So the image on the right is an image of biological Paul, and we can see he's pulling his eyelid down on his left eye. And this is exactly what Katy Perry was doing, except she was doing it with her right eye. So the point I'm trying to make is the one-eyed symbolism, whether it's the eye of Ra or the eye of Horus, has been going on and in our face for a very, very long time. And again, to answer the questions where folks were wondering if Katy had an artificial eye, and my answer is no. She was just doing in-your-face, one-eyed symbolism. This is where we're at today, folks, with their symbols. It's in our face. It's no longer hidden. It's right up in front of us. And that's why it's important, again, to understand the signs and symbols. And with that, let's move to slide number 3 and let's take another look at Billy's eyes. Okay, so slide number 3, the title of the chart, note the edge of the right eye, and as you can see, I have an image of Billy from the Let It Be period. And if we take a look at his right eye, which is on our left, we can see that there's an edge right here to the eye. And I was thinking, is this the edge of the ocular prosthesis? Is this the edge of the artificial eye? When I look at his left eye, which is on our right, I don't see that edge. Now with the next two images, images 2 and 3, what I did was to divide the image in half so that we can isolate the right-hand side of Billy's face and the left-hand side of his face, and specifically the orientation of his eyes. And this is the same thing that I did in the show with Sally and also with Billy Watson. And we can again see that his eyes do not track together. So if we look at his right eye, this is the eye that he's blind in, and the artificial eye he's looking directly at us. And if we move over to image number 3 to the far right, his left eye, which is on our right, is drifting ever so slightly to the left. Now his left eye is his good eye, and his right eye is the artificial eye. Now the discovery by Sally of Billy having an artificial eye is extremely important because it is a physical characteristic that allows us to differentiate biological Paul from Billy, which means we can conclusively say that they are not the same person. The other thing that Sally's discovery allows us to do is to identify doubles and lookalikes that Billy himself has used over the timeline. And last but not least, it ices the deal on whether Billy played the Vivian Stanshall character in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes, because the Stanshall character had the same exact eye configuration. And you have to ask yourself, what are the odds? Okay, so now it's Wednesday, November 9th. I got tied up with a couple of things, and so I'm going to pick up where I left off. So what I'm going to do is to take everybody through 2 slides that I've shown before and to explain why it is, I believe, the eyes prove that Billy played the Vivian Stanshall character. So on this slide, this is a chart that I showed back in 2019 in a presentation I did on McCartney, Stanshall, and Ackrell. And at the time, I didn't know about the artificial eye, obviously, but I did notice that the left eye, with Billy here on the left-hand side as McCartney, and the left eye on the right-hand side with the Vivian Stanshall character, did the same thing. The eye drifts ever so slightly to the left, while the right eye looks straight ahead. So at the time, I viewed this as a characteristic which helped me to conclude that Billy did indeed play the character of Vivian Stanshall in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes. Now, there was another version of Stanshall, and that was played by Victor. And Victor was the very tall, 6'3", lanky version of Stanshall, and to the best of my knowledge, Victor never played with the Bonzo Dog Band. He was an actor and a musician that was on Billy's payroll so that Billy's McCartney and Stanshall character could coexist. Okay, and so with that, let me move to slide number 5, and I have another Billy Stanshall comparison. Okay, so this is slide number 5, and it's another McCartney-Stanshall comparison. This is a slide that I showed on the interview with Billy Watson. And what I would like everybody to do is to notice the overall facial structure. The jawline, the mouth, the mustache, which is identical, and the ear. Now, the ear is a little difficult to pick up on because here we can see on the left-hand side, the McCartney character, we can see the bottom lobe of Billy's ear. And that's not as easy to see here on the Stanshall character because of the sideburns. But if we look above the lobe and we take a look at the ear structure right here, it's the same. And in both images, Billy's right eye, which is his blind eye, looks straight ahead, as his left eye appears lazy and drifts to the left. If we take a look at the noses, we can see that they look very, very similar. Some might argue that they are not exact, and that's because Billy has had nose surgeries to make the nose look more McCartney-ish. And the shape of the eyes look a bit different, and that's because Billy had eye surgery, which is referred to as blepharoplasty. And blepharoplasty is a procedure that surgically removes his excess fat, muscle, and skin from the upper and lower eyelids to redefine the shape of the eye. That's very important. This procedure redefines the shape of the eye. And that's the reason why the shape of the eyes appear different. Okay? But this is the same guy. And the defining characteristic, other than the obvious facial similarities, is the eyes. Again, the right eye is the artificial eye on both characters. The left eye is the good eye. And they don't always track. And it's important to note that for those that are looking at various images on the internet, the eyes are not always going to be out of sync. There are going to be times when the eyes look good. Now, sometimes that's going to be because the eyes just happen to align properly. And other times, it's going to be because the images that you are looking at have been doctored to correct the misalignment of the eyes. Okay? All right, with that, I'm going to move to the next slide, and we're going to talk about Billy's song, Wonderful Christmas Time, and what do the lyrics really say? A few days ago, I received an email from Terry, who is a listener, and they wrote me and said, "Hey, Mike, the lyric in Billy's song, Wonderful Christmas Time, is not the mood, M-O-O-D, is right. He's singing the moon is right." And I'm going to play you a clip in a moment, and we're going to take a listen, and you can decide whether it's moon or mood. And then I'm going to talk about why is it that we're shown Billy's right eye, which is representative of the eye of Ra, versus the left eye, which is Horus, if Billy is supposedly representing Horus, the liberator. But let's take a listen to Wonderful Christmas Time and listen closely. Do you hear him singing moon or mood?
The mood is right. The mood is right. The mood is right. The mood is right. The mood is right.
It sounds like, to me, the moon, M-O-O-N, is right. So let's talk about this a little bit. So as I've mentioned earlier in the presentation, the right eye represents Ra, or the sun, and the left eye represents Horus, or the moon. So the question becomes, if, quote, McCartney represents Horus, then why is McCartney's right eye, the eye of Ra, depicted? And we can just point to this graphic right here in the upper right-hand side of the slide. That's the McCartney eye symbolism. And please note, the way Billy signs his name, the T in McCartney, is an obelisk. But in either case, he's showing us the right eye. Why is that? Is it because the right eye was sacrificed on behalf of Horus, the left eye? And if the lyrics in the song Wonderful Christmas Time is actually saying the moon is right, and the moon represents the left eye, then I believe it's possible Billy's dropping a clue in that song. By singing that the moon is right, he's telling us left is right. So it goes back to, was the right eye sacrificed on behalf of the left eye? Was Ra sacrificed on behalf of Horus, the liberator? Now, the moon, or the left side, or the left-handed path, and I'll get to this in a moment, is something that comes up a number of times within the Beatles circle. For example, Bile Paul was left-handed. Billy sees with his left eye. Heather Mills lost her left leg. Billy wrote a song called Sea Moon. Johnny and the Moondogs was a pre-Beatles name for the band going back to 1959. And George Harrison released a solo song titled Here Comes the Moon. Crowley wrote a book titled Moonchild. The plot involves a magical war between a group of white magicians and a group of black magicians over an unborn child. And of course, Michael Jackson did the moonwalk. And so to better understand the difference between the right-handed path and the left-handed path, I have this blurb in here, and this comes to us from Wikipedia. In Western esotericism, the left-handed path and right-handed path are the dichotomy between two opposing approaches to magic. This terminology is used in various groups involved in the occult and ceremonial magic. In some definitions, the left-handed path is equated with malicious black magic or black shamanism, while the right-hand path with benevolent white magic. Other occultists have criticized this definition, believing that the left-right dichotomy refers merely to different kinds of working and does not necessarily connote good or bad magical actions. And I italicize necessarily because I thought this was a very interesting word to insert in the sentence. Other practitioners state the difference between the two is that the desired outcome of the right is to be beside, quote, God and to serve him, while the left believe in self-deification and bow to no one. And the reason why I bolded this out is because this is Crowleyism. Do as thou wilt. Self-deification. You are a star. You are a god. And you bow to no one because you pursue your true will or your pure will. So if I stitch this together, we have the left eye, which is representative of the moon, which is representative of Horus, who is the liberator, which ties back to Crowley's Eon of Horus. And the Eon of Horus is all about pursuing your true and pure will and to walk the path of self-deification. So the right eye of McCartney, I do believe, is representative of Ra being sacrificed on behalf of Horus. That's what I think it represents. And anyone who has some additional information or insights, please feel free to comment below. Okay, so with that, I'm going to now move to this interview I told you about, which took place in August of 1966. It was the BBC interviewing Paul McCartney and John Lennon at Paul's house. And the dialogue is very interesting, to say the least. Okay, so before I get to the interview, I have a couple of setup slides. And these slides, at least the first 4 or 5 of them, come from my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? And I need to give you this backdrop so that we have a better understanding of the interview when I play it for you. So the songwriting process is a creative process. Many times the music comes first, other times it's the lyrics. But in either case, whichever comes first, the music or the lyrics, you start to write the structure of the song. And the structure of the song would be the verse, the bridge, the chorus, and the melody. And once you've done that, you've created a draft or working version of the song, knowing that in all likelihood, there are going to be puts and takes. In other words, you might adjust some of the chords, you might rewrite some of the lyrics, you may change the melody, and so on. And then what you'll have is a working demo of the song. And if you deem the song as worthy, in other words, it's a pretty good song, and you want to proceed with showing it to your band members or possibly recording it, you would do that. Or it's possible that after you write a song or try to write a song, you're thinking, I don't think so. So you might set it aside or shelve it for a future date, or it may never see the light of day. But let's just say you write the song and you like it. The next step would be that you would present it to your band members and or collaborators. And once you play it for them, there's going to be band and collaborator input, which in all likelihood will result in additional changes and adjustments to the song because you're getting feedback from your band members. And once you have that input, you make some more adjustments, and then you rehearse the song with your band. And even during rehearsal, there can be changes to the song. But let's just say you rehearse the song and you get it down and you really like it, you nail it. Then what happens is you record the basic track in the studio. So the basic track would be the rhythm guitars, the bass, and the drums. Other times it could also mean the keyboards. And after you get the basic track done, you add overdubs. So the overdubs would be the vocals, the harmonies, and any other arrangements. Lead guitar as an example. And once you get all of the tracks down, instrumentals and vocals, you mix the song so you have the right levels between the instruments and the vocals. And then if you're going to release the song, either on an album or as a single, you're going to have the track mastered. And then back in the day, a lacquer would be cut, and the lacquer would be the beginning of pressing the vinyl. So that's not done today, typically, because today everything is digital, although many bands today are still releasing vinyl records. But that's the process in a nutshell. And it's very important to remember, and I have this at the bottom of the chart, there is almost always starts and stops with song creation. Many times a songwriter will start writing a few songs in order to get to one which they consider worthy of recording. Okay, so again, this is a high-level summary of how the songwriting process works. And if you don't believe me, bring this slide to any other songwriter and they will tell you, yeah, that's pretty much how it works. Okay? And so with that, let's move to slide number 8. And again, this is a chart that I showed in my big presentation. Did the Beatles write all their own music? Okay, so this is a slide that is in my big presentation, but I've shown it a number of times. And this is an article, a Mersey Beat article that goes back to 1962, and it's the August-September time frame of 1962. And the title of the article, Beatles Change Drummers. So this is when Pete Best was out and Ringo was in. But we have this paragraph right here, and I circled it, and here's what it says. The Beatles will fly to London to make recordings at EMI Studios. They will be recording numbers that have been specifically written for the group, which they have received from their recording manager, George Martin. Let me read that again. The Beatles will fly to London to make recordings at EMI Studios. They will be recording numbers that have been specifically written for the group, which they have received from their recording manager, George Martin. Okay, so this, folks, is what is referred to as a smoking gun. If I go to the next slide, this is another chart that I have shown. Let me move my PIP box here. I'll move it down here. And you can see I have that paragraph right here in the upper right-hand side of the chart. So the official narrative tells us that John Lennon and Paul McCartney allegedly wrote 100 songs between 1956 and 1962, up to the point where they signed with EMI and George Martin. Yet we don't see any of these 100 songs. And by the way, the claim of 100 songs between 1956 and 1962 comes from an official Beatle documentary that was released in the 1980s called The Complete Beatles, which was considered the documentary on the Beatles until Anthology. Now, with the Decca audition, they played 3 nondescript originals, Like Dreamers Do, Hello Little Girl, and Love of the Loved. So the question to ask is, where are the other 97 songs? And if they had this backlog of music, why were they recording numbers that were specifically written for them, which were given to them by George Martin? And going back to the timeline between 1960 through 1963, I laid out everything that was going on behind the scenes. The manufacturing process, if you will, the manufacturing of the Beatles. The public was given the Cinderella story, but behind the curtain, the great Oz was at work. And again, the reason why I'm showing you these slides, many of you have probably seen them before if you've watched my other presentations, is because the backstory, the real backstory, has to be understood. So that when we listen to this audio I'm going to play for you in a moment, it'll make a lot more sense. Okay? So if I go to slide number 10, let's take a trip back to Rubber Soul. And again, this comes from my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? And I will leave the link to that presentation down below. We are told that the Beatles returned from their U.S. tour. They had a 6-week break before the tour ending and coming into the studio on October 11th to do the Rubber Soul sessions. The official narrative tells us that there was no backlog of songs coming into the Rubber Soul sessions. So that meant starting on October 11th through November 11th, the 30-day period which constitutes the Rubber Soul sessions, the Beatles, specifically John Lennon and Paul McCartney, had to write from scratch, rehearse, arrange with George Martin's help, record, and mix 16 songs within 30 days. 14 for the album, and 2 more songs for a single that was going to be released, Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out. And on top of that, they needed to do a fan club Christmas flexi disc. And as I mentioned, the Rubber Soul sessions began on October 11th, 1965 and concluded on November 11th, 1965. So that's the 30 days. And the reason why they had to wrap up by November 11th is because they needed to release Rubber Soul, get it into retail, into the stores by December 3rd of 1965 in time for the Christmas season. And then the official story tells us that the Beatles came into the studio midday, not in the morning, but they started midday. And they would stay until midnight and into the early morning hours. And the official story also tells us that the tape recorder was rolling continuously to capture takes. And this was done in order to do comping. And I will explain comping in a moment. Okay, so let's move to slide number 11. Okay, so today is Tuesday, November 15th, and we had company over the weekend, so I had to put the recording on pause, and I'm going to pick up where I left off. So, we're on slide 11, and this slide was in my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? And what I did with this chart was to show how many takes the Beatles took to get the basic rhythm tracks down. And the basic rhythm tracks or backing tracks would include the bass guitar, the drums, rhythm guitars, and sometimes the keyboards. And I sourced this information from Mark Lewison's book, The Beatles Recording Sessions. So I'll go through some of the songs, and we can see Revolution number 1, 22 takes. Blackbird, 32. Goodnight, 34. Obla-Dee, Obla-Da, 24. Sexy Sadie, 117. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, 44. Helter Skelter, 21. Glass Onion, 34. I Will, 68. Happiness is a Warm Gun, 70. And then Not Guilty, which didn't make the White Album, 102. Okay, so we can see that there were a lot of takes to get these songs down. Now let's go to the next slide, which was also in my big presentation, and take a look at the number of takes for the songs on Rubber Soul. Okay, so let's take a look at Rubber Soul. Drive My Car, 4 takes. Norwegian Wood, 5. You Won't See Me, 2. Nowhere Man, 5. Think for Yourself, 1. The Word, 3. Michelle, 1. What Goes On, 1. Girl, 2. I'm Looking Through You, 4. In My Life, 3. For the song Wait, the basic tracks were completed during the help sessions. It wasn't during the Rubber Soul session, so I zeroed that one out. If I Needed Someone, 1 take. Run for Your Life, 5 takes. Day Tripper, 3. And We Can Work It Out, 2. And remember, there were 14 songs for the album, and then 2 songs, Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out, for the single. Now, if we go back to the previous chart, take a look at the number of takes. 22, 32, 34, 24, 21, 30, 117, 44, 17, and so on. Then, back to Rubber Soul. 4, 5, 2, 5, 1, 3, and so on. So, what's going on here? The official narrative tells us that the Beatles came into the Rubber Soul sessions on October 11th, 1965, with essentially no backlog of music. They had to write from scratch and then rehearse the songs, and the songs then had to be arranged and recorded. And we've got these types of numbers here. Not one take exceeds 5. Whereas if we go back to the White Album, we have double-digit takes across the board. In some cases, like Sexy Sadie, 117 takes, Not Guilty, 102. So we do have to ask the question, what happened to their prowess? Because leading into the White Album, they didn't have to write from scratch, because the official narrative tells us that they were writing songs when they were in India. And we're also told that they did the Isha demo back in May of 1968. And remember, it's an unknown day in 1968. Quite a feat, where they recorded 27 demos in one day, but that day has not been documented. But the point being is, the official narrative tells us that they had material going into the White Album, whereas with Rubber Soul, they did not. So if they didn't have any material written going into the Rubber Soul sessions, and they were able to nail the basic tracks down in 5 takes or less, yet with the White Album, we're told that they came into the studio with material. In fact, we're told that they did a demo, a 27-song demo in May of 1968, yet the number of takes to get the basic tracks down is in double digits, in some cases triple digits. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the story here? I'm betting that these numbers represent the number of takes that the studio musicians took to get the songs down. So let's move to slide number 13 and look a little deeper into Rubber Soul. Okay, so the slide on the left is a chart I had in the big presentation where I detailed out what was taking place on each day according to the official narrative. And it's worthwhile noting that there are days in which the Beatles were not in the studio or no recording was taking place. As an example, on October 19th, there was no recording because they were working on a fan club flexi disc. On October 25th and 26th, there was no recording because George Martin and Norman Smith were mixing the songs down, along with the Beatles receiving their MBEs on October 26th. And if we go to November 1st and November 2nd, the Beatles were not recording because they had a TV show commitment. I also have dates highlighted in light blue with the word open, and that denotes where I could not find in the official narrative any specific activity that the Beatles did on that day. So what I did was I assumed that the Beatles were heads down, writing and working on songs. In other words, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. So wherever you see a date where it says open, I assumed they were working on songs. Okay? So if we move over to the table on the right-hand side, what I did was to take data from the chart on the left and summarize it so that we can see on what day did the Beatles finish a particular song, And how many days did it take from when they entered into the studio on October 11th? Remember, that was the first day. How many days transpired before that song was completed? And to the far right is a column denoting the number of takes for that song. So if we take a look at Run for Your Life, we're told that that finished on October 12th, one day after arriving in the studio, and the song took 5 takes. Drive My Car on October 13th, 2 days in, 4 takes. Day Tripper on October 16th, 5 days in, 3 takes. October 18th, If I Needed Someone, 7 days in, 1 take. Norwegian Wood, October 21st, 10 days in, 5 takes. And then we're told on October 22nd, 2 songs were completed, In My Life and Nowhere Man. 11 days in the studio with 8 takes for both songs. October 29th, 18 days in, We Can Work It Out is completed, 2 takes. And then on November 3rd, 23 days in, Michelle is finished, 1 take. 24 days in, on November 4th, What Goes On is completed, 1 take. Think for Yourself, November 8th, 28 days in, 1 take. And then on November 10th, they complete The Word, that's 30 days in, 3 takes. And then on the very last day of recording, November 11th, we are told the Beatles completed 4 songs. You Won't See Me, Girl, Wait, and I'm Looking Through You. And it took 8 takes to complete all 4 of those songs. So the first problem that I see is there has to be overlap with regard to writing the songs, creating the melody, working through the vocals, working through the harmonies, and rehearsing the songs. Remember, the official narrative tells us that the Beatles came in empty, that they had no backlog of songs. So the process, if we are to believe what the official narrative tells us, is that they were heads down writing multiple songs at the same time, working through the song structure, working through the vocals, working through the harmonies, working through their individual parts as far as their instruments goes. It just doesn't hold any water. And also remember that the official narrative tells us that they did not arrive in the studio until midday. And then they left late in the evening, going into the early hours of the next morning, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. in the morning. So this process where they had to be writing songs concurrently, this overlapping process, made its way all the way through the timeline. To come in with nothing and then bang out songs at the rate and pace that they didn't happen. And then when we couple that with the number of takes, it becomes even more far-fetched. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I believe that the number of takes represents the number of takes by the studio musicians. And when the Beatles came into the studio on October 11th, and they were shown the songs, they were listening to the playback, that playback, in all likelihood, already had a vocal track and a track with harmonies. And that would have been there as a placeholder in order for the Beatles to learn the songs, to learn the vocal parts. And once they learned the vocals, then that's when the recording of the vocals took place. And if you recall, in an earlier slide, the official narrative tells us that the recorder was running continuously. And I believe the reason why that was done was in order to comp the vocals. So vocal comping describes the process of combining multiple vocal tracks into one, quote, super take that has the best parts of each. This is called a composite track or comp for short. And it's important to understand that comping in the music business, in the studio, is a standard operating procedure. It's done all the time. And so what I'm going to do now is to go to slide 14, and I'm going to give you an overview of comping and a quick illustration of how it works. Alrighty, so I'm going to take you through a high-level overview of comping, and I want to emphasize it is a high-level overview. There's a lot more to it, but I'm going to give you the basics. Back in the day, during the Rubber Soul sessions, Norman Smith was the engineer. George Martin, of course, was the producer. For the sake of this illustration, I'm going to refer to vocal comping, but comping can be done for guitars, bass, and so on. But the reason why I'm going to focus on vocal comping is because that's what the Beatles were doing during their recording session for Rubber Soul and other recording sessions. They did multiple takes of the vocals, both lead and harmonies, and then the engineer, in this case Norman Smith, and the producer George Martin, took the best of these takes and created a composite super take, which would be the finalized vocal track. That's why the official narrative tells us that the recorders were running continuously. And by doing so, this allowed Norman Smith and George Martin to ensure that they had enough vocal content to work with in order to create the super take or the finalized vocal tracks. Now, I should also mention that during the analog tape days, the process of comping was an art and required considerable skill on the part of the engineer and the producer. They did not have the functionality that we have today to undo, to copy and paste, and to do other edits like move parts of a song around. In fact, back in the day, undo usually resulted in redo. In other words, you had to re-record the track. So the engineer had to take a lot of time, a lot of care in ensuring that they didn't do something that was going to be an irrevocable error. So very, very different to how we do our comping and our editing today. The technology of today clearly did not exist back during the analog tape days. Now, to the right, you see 3 recorders. The one on the far left is a 2-track recorder. And if memory serves me well, the Beatles' first 2 albums, Please Please Me and With the Beatles, were recorded on 2-track machines. The middle machine is a 4-track recorder. That's the type of machine that was used to record Rubber Soul. And to the right is a 16-track recorder. Now, if we go back to the left-hand side of the chart, you see I have a yellow box. And what I'm going to do is to step you through a very high-level overview of how comping works. There's more to it, but this is the basics. So a 4-track machine means it has a 4-track tape, and that tape can record 4 individual tracks. So we have track 1, track 2, track 3, and track 4. So for the sake of illustration, let's assume that track 1 contains the instrumental mix of the song. This is the song without the vocals. And the engineer and or producer decides that track 2 and 3 are going to be open to do the vocal comping, and track 4 is going to be the composite track. This is the track that's going to ultimately contain the final vocal or the super take. So the way this would have worked is Norman Smith would hit the record button for track 2, start the song, and have John or Paul sing the lead vocal. And then once they were done, Norman would rewind the tape and go back to the very beginning and run through the lead vocal again. But this time, instead of recording on track 2, he's going to record the vocal on track 3. So now what we have is 2 tracks, track 2 and track 3, with the lead vocal. Then Norman Smith and George Martin would listen to the playback and decide which of the 2 takes is the best. And once they make that determination, Norman Smith would take, let's just say track 2 or vocal number 1 was the best. They would bounce that to track number 4. So now track 4 contains the exact vocal as track 2. But remember, this is what they deemed to be the best of the first two takes. It does not mean it is the best or the final vocal. So let's just say they're listening to the playback of track 4, which is the comp track, the track that's going to contain the super take or the final vocal. And as they're listening, certain phrasing is not right, or maybe a couple of notes might be a little sharp, a little flat, and so they're thinking to themselves, we have to do another take. And so what would happen is they keep track 4, because remember, that's the baseline track, and Norman Smith would go in and delete the content of track 2 and track 3. So vocal 1 and vocal 2 go away. And then Norman Smith and George Martin would have John or Paul step back up to the microphone and do another run through of the vocals. And Norman would record that on track 2, and this then would be take 3 or vocal 3 of the lead vocal. And then he would rewind the tape and have John or Paul sing the song again, but this time he's going to record the 4th take on track 3. And then once they're done singing the vocal, now George Martin and Norman Smith have 2 more takes to work with where they can fine-tune track 4. So let's just say the phrasing that they wanted to improve is captured on take 3 of the vocals, which would be on track 2. What Norman Smith would then do is to bounce or insert that piece of track 2 or vocal number 3 or take number 3 to track number 4. So think of it as inserting the proper phrasing or the improved phrasing into the composite track. Now, the way this would work is Norman Smith would mute track 1. I should have mentioned this earlier because you don't want the instrumental track playing, because once you hit the record button on track 4, the composite track, if you don't mute track 1, the music's going to come through. So track 1 is muted. So with track 1 muted, we have both vocal tracks running simultaneously, track 2 and track 4. And when they're getting to the timestamp where the new phrasing has to be inserted, Norman Smith would push the record button on track 4 so that it captures what's being played on track 2, which is the new phrasing. And once that bit that he and George Martin wanted to improve upon is done, he then presses the record button off to ensure that it only captures that piece of the vocal that they wanted to improve upon. Again, this is a high-level overview of comping. And you can see how the vocals were pieced together in order to create the composite or super take of the vocals. And in my example, I went through 3 takes. But it could be 10 takes. It could be 15. It could be 20. So when the official narrative tells us that the tape was running continuously, this is what I believe George Martin and Norman Smith were doing. They were trying to capture as many vocal takes as they possibly could in order to comp those tracks to create the super take of the vocals. And with that, I'm going to move to slide number 15, and we're going to take a listen to Beatles author Philip Norman explain what the relationship was like between George Martin and George Harrison. Okay, as we listen to this clip from Beatles author Philip Norman, I would like you to keep 2 things in mind as he's speaking. The first thing is he talks about the relationship between George Martin and George Harrison and how George Martin used to dictate what George Harrison was going to play on his guitar. That's number 1. And as we're listening to that, go back to this slide and think about the rate and pace in which the Beatles had to write and rehearse in order to create the songs for Rubber Soul. And then say to yourself, how is it possible that that rate and pace was taking place when George Martin, the producer, is dictating to George what to play on his guitar. Point number 2 is when Philip Norman explains how George Harrison came into his own once he brought the sitar into the Beatles recording sessions. And of course, we would be talking about Norwegian wood. But here's the point I want to make, and I've made this point before in other videos. Regarding the sitar, it's more probable a studio player like Big Jim Sullivan played the sitar on Norwegian wood and not George Harrison. Harrison's connection with the sitar was manufactured to introduce Eastern religious concepts into Western culture. Eastern religion was a key thread within the ideologies of Blavatsky and Crowley. Okay, and so with that, let's take a listen to what Philip Norman has to say.
As soon as Harrison took the sitar into the studio, he became important, because up to that point, George Martin, the producer of the Beatles, was terrible to him. He used to say, "You will play these notes."
George Martin, the producer of the Beatles, was terrible to him. He used to say, "You will play these notes."
Here they are on the piano, "You will play this." He was the underdog of the Beatles. He was the one who had the most miserable time. Harrison was very much younger, in particular, than Lennon, and Lennon used to patronize him and call him that kid. That stuck for an awful long time. That's another root of this sort of resentment and this feeling of discomfort and rancor that he had as a Beatle.
So again, folks, the reason why I'm playing these clips and covering the material that I've covered leading into the interview with the BBC and John and Paul is because it is important to understand the context, because once you hear the interview, a lot of the pieces of the puzzle should come together. Okay, so with the next clip, this is a clip that I've played before. It's an interview where George Harrison explains that both he and Ringo did not practice. So let's take a listen.
On your album is also Ringo Starr, and you said, "He is like myself with the guitar." What did you mean by that?
Well, we've grown, for so many years, grown up together, and as a drummer, I know Ringo is a great drummer, but he is bad, he doesn't practice. But it doesn't seem to matter, he just picks up the drumsticks, and for my songs he's very good, because he listened to the song once, and he knows exactly what to play. He was the kind of drummer who never likes drum solos, so he just keeps good time, and he instinctively knows when there's a little piece that needs a fill. And it's the same with me. You know, people call me a guitar player, and in a way I'm a guitar player, but I never practice. There's years and years in my life where I never picked the guitar up except just to make a record. But I know I could be quite good, but I don't practice enough.
Okay, so very interesting. Here we have George saying that he doesn't practice, and there's times when he's gone years and years where he didn't pick the guitar up, and he only picked it up when he went into the studio to record. And that doesn't seem very credible to me either, that he hasn't practiced, he hasn't played, and then he's going to show up in the studio and he's going to lay down guitar tracks. And of course he's talking about Ringo never practicing as well. And what I don't have in this presentation, but which many of you have heard, is the interview with Bernard Purdie going back to the early 2000s, where he said there were 4 drummers on Beatle tracks, and Ringo was not one of them. And folks have asked me, who do I think the 4 drummers were? Well, Andy White, we know for sure because he's in the official narrative. We know that Bernard Purdie was one of those drummers because Bernard has been saying for the last 45 years that he drummed on 21 Beatles songs. And then with the next slide, I'm going to show you a correspondence that I had with a relative of the late, great Ronnie Verrill, who was a great drummer. Ronnie died in 2002, and my source told me that Ronnie also drummed on Beatles songs. And the 4th drummer has always been a bit of a question mark, an enigma, but if I had to guess, Hal Blaine from the Wrecking Crew. And the period I'm talking about, by the way, is 1962 through 1966, because starting with Sgt. Pepper, Ringo did drum on Beatle tracks. Not all of them, but he did drum on some of them. But from 62 through 66, according to Bernard Purdy, he didn't drum on any of those tracks. Okay, so with that, let's move to the next slide and talk about Ronnie Verrill. Okay, so this is an email that I received going back to 2020. It was after I released my big presentation to the Beatles Write All Their Own Music. And I also did a video about Ronnie Verrill, and I will leave that link in the description box below. So this is what the email said. Hi Mike, since more ghosts have come out of the cupboard, my father was a jazz musician playing alto sax, clarinet, and flute. He could also tickle the keyboard. In session work, he played in a studio environment with many stars of years gone by and worked on many film scores. He started off working with the Eric Winston Big Band and also Ted Heath. All his friends were in music. Ronnie Verrill was my godfather. He was also Animal in the Muppets and used by many groups as a session drummer, including the Beatles. I, like so many, liked the Beatles when I was younger, but was always told by my father that they were just a prefabricated band who could do the job on the stage, but nowhere else. He also would always tell me Ringo was a very poor drummer and could never nail a song in the studio, whereas Ronnie would have the drum parts nailed by mid-afternoon just in time for a pint and a cheese roll. There was even some days when Ringo was absent from the studio. My father hated the Beatles, but looking back now, I think he knew exactly what was going on. I wish these guys were still with us. I tell you though, my dad liked Quincy Jones because of the studio work and love of jazz. Gregory Martin will also know the score. I used to like the Beatles, but now cringe to even listen to them. What exactly are the Beatles? Many thanks. And that was the email that was sent to me 2 years ago. And what's interesting about this email is this person mentions Quincy Jones. And of course, Quincy Jones was quoted in Spin magazine as saying that the Beatles, specifically Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, were no-playing MFers. And in that interview, he explains that he's working on one of Ringo's solo albums, and Ringo could not get the drumming down. And who did Quincy Jones call in? He called in Ronnie Verrill. Okay, so I just wanted to do a refresh on Ronnie. As I mentioned, he passed away in 2002. And with the next slide, here's Ronnie recording at Abbey Road Studios. And he's with Stefani Grappelli, who was a jazz violinist, and Yehudi Menuhin. I hope I got this person's name right. I probably botched it, who was a violinist and conductor. So here's Ronnie here, the big arrow pointing down. This is Ronnie drumming at Abbey Road Studios. Okay, so with that, let's finally get to the August 5th, 1966 BBC interview with Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Okay, so as promised, here's the August 5th, 1966 BBC interview at Paul's home. And if the date of August 5th, 1966 sounds familiar to you, well, that's the same day that Revolver was released. The interview itself was released on August 29th, 1966, and that was the same day as the Beatles' final concert. Now, what I'm going to play are excerpts from the interview. The full interview is about 25 minutes. I will put the link down below. And here's the dichotomy right out of the chute. Per their own words, John and Paul were not writing songs in between albums. We are told most of the material was written leading into or during the recording or film sessions. That is, they were writing on demand. While they also tell us their songwriting was a process and not spontaneous. So some of the interesting excerpts from the interview: John and Paul discussed the songwriting process, and as I mentioned, it's not spontaneous. And then John, talking about writing a song, says that I find it just as hard, words or music. And then Paul says, we took weeks just to try to get one written. We don't write in between LPs normally. And then the BBC interviewer makes an interesting observation. I always thought it was quite impossible, really, to say we've got to write 12 songs for an LP. So what the interviewer is saying is, it's kind of hard to believe that you spontaneously and on demand write 12 songs. And then John, in response to the BBC reporter's comments, says, it is some days. On this last album, it was very impossible. And of course, the album they're talking about is Revolver. And then Paul discusses George Martin and studio players. And then Paul makes a very interesting comment. He says, we're limited as a group. We're the first to say we're not all that good musically. That's a staggering statement coming from Paul McCartney. We're the first to say we're not all that good musically. And of course, fast forward to 1980 in the Playboy interview, and John Lennon says that none of us are technical musicians, none of us could read music, none of us can write it. And then we have to remember that not one song from Revolver was played during their live performances after the album was released on August 5th, 1966. Okay, so I called these points out. I also added captions. So with that, let's take a listen to what the lads have to say.
Well, in fact, when you are faced with a situation of having to turn something out, do you then try running over phrases on a guitar that have been going through your mind for some time, seeing what you can make?
That's another trick. To try an old song,
Yes.
you know, one that never quite made it, and take a bit out of it that wasn't bad.
In other words,
And try
doctor
and make that into a song.
Yes. Do you store away in your minds odd phrases that you hear from time to time that would make a good title?
Well, I think I try to, but I always forget them if they're stored away in my mind. They might come back without me knowing. There's bits from other records I think I'll pinch that, and I'll never remember it.
Well, you jumped in very quickly there, John. Does this mean that you're the words expert in particular?
No. You know, I find it just as hard, words or music.
Do you both have to be in the right mood when you're working together, collaborating on a song?
Yeah.
Does one have to wait for the other to
Very
start?
seldom, you know. If we both don't feel like it, we just have another ciggy.
And if one does the other say, well wait till next week?
The only time we've got to do that, when we've got to actually sort of force ourselves to write it, is when we've got an LP coming up, or we've got a film coming up or something. And then it's a bit of a drag for the first, say, 2 songs, because you really got to, you know. In fact, the last LP, wow, we took weeks just trying to get one written, you know, to get back into the swing of it, because we don't write in between LPs normally. Maybe just write sort of 1 or 2.
Wow, we took weeks just trying to get one written, you know, to get back into the swing of it, because we don't write in between LPs normally. Maybe just write sort of 1 or 2.
And then we have a great big batch.
I'd have thought it was quite impossible, really, to say, right, we've got to write 12 songs for an LP. Let's settle down to it.
It is some days. On this last time was very impossible.
It is some days. On this last time was very impossible.
Because I don't know,
You get,
holiday spirit.
you know, the sun shining, and well, it was at the time. In
So
fact,
we tried writing them in the garden then. And then you forget about it, start looking at flowers and trees and things like that, really.
I guess he gives you some ideas when you're recording your songs. Do you give him any ideas on his recordings of your songs?
Sometimes we go along to the sessions, you know. B gives us more ideas than we give him, I think. Because he's at all of our sessions and we're not at all of his. In fact, I think I've been to 1.
Did you get any particular interest out of the bigger lineup that was available to him?
Oh, yes, yeah. It's, the only trouble, the main trouble with having big lineups and things is you use session men. And session men are all great technically. But you've got to write exactly what you want out on paper for session men. And so it's easier with us, because you can sort of say to George, no, not that, a bit more like so-and-so. And, you know, and he'd do it, you know what you meant. But if you said to a session man, no, you know, do it a bit like sort of, you know, well, then he'd need it written down. So that's the only big trouble, really, with doing it with big bands. You've got to know exactly how to write, and it's very difficult to write bending notes and things on instruments. You can't, and so that's why sometimes the versions by other people can sound a bit square.
You have since then recorded some more with an unusual instrumentation in the backing. Was this inspired by the success of Yesterday, or did you do it because you liked it?
Well, the idea for Yesterday of doing it like that was because we're limited as a group. We're the first to say that we're not all that good anyway musically.
We're limited as a group. We're the first to say that we're not all that good anyway musically.
So there was something like Yesterday. The best we could have done with it would have been This Boy or If I Fell. Those are sort of, I think, two of the best that we've done like that with a group and still managed to put the song over in the way it should have been. But with Yesterday, it would have just meant either another If I Fell or another This Boy, another Beatles combo doing a slow one, So we did it like that, and nobody seemed to mind. Least of all us, I think, because we didn't have to play and we didn't have to show ourselves up again. We're limited as a group. We're the first to say that we're not all that good anyway, musically.
Okay, so did you catch all of that? It was a very interesting conversation because on one hand, as I mentioned earlier, at the top of the chart, they're telling us that they were not writing songs in between albums normally, and saying that most of the material was written leading into or during the recording or film sessions, again, on demand, spontaneously, while they are also telling us that their songwriting was a process and not spontaneous. And then Paul saying we're limited as a group. We're the first to say we're not all that good musically. And then he talks about George Martin and how they could just tell George Martin what it is they liked, and George Martin would just do it. But Paul never explains what exactly it was that George Martin would do. And Paul's comment about not being able to annotate bends in music is flat out wrong. It's just not true. So the way it's done is an arrow would go up from note to note, and then it would be annotated with a step, a half step, a full step as an example, or the arrow would go down if you're going from a higher note to a lower note. And again, the step would be annotated, a half note or a full note. So what we got with this interview, in my opinion, is some very good doublespeak. And I would argue with this interview, if you read between the lines, if you strip away all of the idol worship and all of the romanticism about the Beatles, you're hearing some very important dialogue. They find it hard to write music at times. It's not spontaneous. They're not writing songs in between albums. That's a big one, because so many people that want to argue the point about whether they wrote all of their own music are trying to make a case that they were writing all the time in their spare time. They were writing in hotels, they were writing on airplanes, they were writing while they were on the crapper. And then, Shazam. Paul McCartney comes out and tells us, we typically do not write songs in between albums. We do all of our writing on demand, spontaneously, leading into or during an album or film, and then go on to explain that songwriting is a process and it is not spontaneous and it is not on demand. And the clincher, when McCartney said, we're limited as a group. We're the first to say we're not all that good musically. So how did they bang out all those songs, 16 songs in 30 days for Rubber Soul? And again, the last bullet, because this interview took place right after they wrapped up Revolver. Not one song from Revolver was played during their live performances after the album was released on August 5th, 1966. And why is that? I would argue the reason for that is because they didn't know how to play the songs. They didn't write the songs. They weren't on the recorded tracks for Revolver. They did the vocals just like they did with Rubber Soul. And all the other albums, the 7 albums between Please Please Me and Revolver. So I'll let you guys and gals decide what your takeaway is from this interview, but from my perspective, this only solidifies my position that they did not write all their own music. Okay, so with that, let's revisit the slide from Rubber Soul where I laid out exactly how it worked. Okay, so here's the summary slide that I have in my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? It's the slide that encapsulated what happened with Rubber Soul and how it really worked. So I'll take it step by step. So it's numbered 1 through 9, and numbers 1 through 4 are all George Martin. All the songs for Rubber Soul were written and arranged. All Rubber Soul instrumental tracks recorded by session musicians and George Martin. All Rubber Soul song titles, runtime, sequencing, etc. were completed. The album art, sleeves, labels are sent out for printing and completed, pending vinyl records to package. And this all took place between January and October of 1965. So as George Martin was doing all this between January and October of 1965, the Beatles were performing their Christmas shows. They were recording the vocals for the Help album. They did the film Help. And they also had their European and U.S. tour during this time period. So when the Beatles came in on October 11th for 30 days through November 11th, the Beatles recorded the vocals and harmonies to the existing and completed instrumental tracks. And if we move to step number 6, the final vocals were mixed down with the previously completed instrumental tracks. This happened between November 12th and the 16th. And then with step 7, on November 17th, we have the final mono lacquer cut. And this starts the process to finalize the stampers and have the initial run of Rubber Soul pressed and packaged and out to the retail outlets by December 3rd of 1965 in time for the Christmas season. So there you have it. That's my take on how it all went down. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I have a clip from McCartney 321, the Hulu special, where Billy is in discussion with Rick Rubin, and it's a very interesting discussion that has to do with the bass line in the song While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Okay, so here's a clip from the Hulu special, McCartney 321, and I got a chuckle out of this clip because it's as if Billy is baffled by the bass playing on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. It certainly does not come across as if he was the guy playing bass on the song. And we have to keep in mind that the official narrative tells us that McCartney did play bass on the song, and he played bass on his Fender Jazz bass versus his usual Hofner or Rickenbacker. Also, take a look at the lighting effect. We're going to see a lot of that one-eyed shadowing taking place. So let's take a listen.
All right. Doesn't even sound like a bass.
Very aggressive sound, isn't it?
Considering it's accompanying this.
Yeah.
I don't know how someone controlled you.
I've never heard a bass sound like that before. It's very unusual. It's almost like 2 songs are happening simultaneously.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? It's like 2 whole, either one of them great, and then right on top of each other.
This is another song here.
Yeah.
Well, no, baby, like she's got that. Yeah, you got it, yeah. Oh.
till my guitar gently
Fascinating. No, it's just amazing.
That's interesting you bring that up. I was not conscious of that till we listen to it now. I hear that tone on it, and it's like, wow.
If you had a studio musician come in, the best musician in the world, to play on your new song, he would not play that.
We'll never do that.
No, because it's not.
He'd be much more sensible.
It's unreal, isn't it? So my takeaway from this is that Billy did not play bass on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Who the bass player is, I don't know, because if it was him, he wouldn't come across as baffled about what Rick Rubin is taking him through. He would have said, well, this is how I got that tone, and this is how I did it, and yet none of that dialogue takes place. Okay, by the way, I also think that Eric Clapton played the lead on Old Brown Shoe, not just While My Guitar Gently Weeps, but that's just my opinion. Okay, now I'm going to go to another George Harrison song, actually two, Long, Long, Long and Piggies, and I'm going to explain my logic behind why it is that I don't believe George Harrison wrote the song Piggies, that it was actually Theodore Adorno. Okay, so going back a few weeks ago, I did a show with Mark Devlin. I was the guest, and we talked about the Beatles. And during that show, I had mentioned that the song Long, Long, Long and Piggies were not both written by George Harrison, although both songs were credited to George Harrison. I had said on the show that I believe that Long, Long, Long was written by George, but Piggies was not. And after the show, in the comments section, there was a person that took issue with me saying that and asking, how could I even come to that conclusion? What's the basis of me saying that? Of course, they were all agitated that I would say that George Harrison was not the songwriter, or there was a ghostwriter where George was credited as the writer of the song. And so I tried to explain the best I could in the comments section why I said what I said. And so what I'm going to do is to take you through two slides to show you why it is I think that Theodore Adorno was the songwriter or the composer of the song Piggies. So with that, let me move to slide number 23, and let me move my PIP down here. There's a picture of Theodore Adorno. And we're asking the question, did Adorno write Piggies? So to understand why I said what I said during the show, we have to have an understanding of Theodore Adorno's ideology and his philosophy. So Adorno was a German philosopher, sociologist, psychologist, and composer known for his critical theory of society. He was a leading member of the Frankfurt School, promoting socialism. He was influenced by Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche. He rejected capitalism and traditional metaphysics. He criticized jazz and popular music because he felt it was part of the culture industry sustaining capitalism. Adorno believed that capitalist-driven mass media and mass culture appeals to the lowest common denominator in pursuit of maximum profit. He identified popular culture as a reason why people become passive. The easy pleasures available through consumption of popular culture made people docile and content no matter how terrible their economic circumstances. He argued that humans in modern society are programmed at work and in their leisure, and relegated to the role of producers at work and consumers at home. Adorno's philosophy aligns with the human potential movement and Tavistock's social engineering agenda to break down traditional societal and cultural dogmas, for example, capitalism, including religion. Adorno claimed that within what he referred to as the culture industry, the leisure time of people becomes toxic. He believed free time should be used to expand and develop ourselves in order to change society for the better. He also believed that capitalism does not sell us the things we really need, and our real wants are shielded from us by the system. He claimed humans settle for manufactured desires when what we really need is tenderness, understanding, calm, insight, and community. He believed fascist beliefs are embedded within society. To prove this, Adorno designed a questionnaire called the F scale, or the fascist scale, which he distributed to every school in West Germany. The questionnaire assessed responses to statements such as obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn, and if people would talk less and work more, everybody would be better off. And when a person has a problem or worry, it is best for him not to think about it, but to keep busy with more cheerful things. He concluded the population at large suffers from psychological frailties. Okay, so now let's go take a look at what we see in the song Piggies. Now, let me bring my PIP up here now. Now, this comes to us from Wikipedia. Wikipedia tells us that Piggies is written by George Harrison as a social commentary. The song serves as an Orwellian satire on greed and consumerism. Among several elements, the song incorporates from classical music. The track features harpsichord and orchestral strings in the Baroque pop style, which are contrasted by Harrison's acerbic lyrics and the sound of grunting pigs. In the context of the turbulent political climate of 1968, Piggies was adopted by the counterculture as an anti-establishment theme song. In his 1980 autobiography, I Me Mine, Harrison describes Piggies as social commentary. He intended it as a light-hearted satire on consumerism and class distinction. So, if we take a look at some of the words I underlined, social commentary, Orwellian satire on greed and consumerism, this is all Adorno. The song incorporates from classical music. Again, this is Theodore Adorno. The track features harpsichord and orchestral strings in the Baroque pop style. Baroque. This is Theodore Adorno. Anti-establishment. Theodore Adorno. So this is why I said what I said, aside from the fact there are very, very clear distinctions in song structure. For me, it's easy to tell that the person that wrote Long, Long, Long is not the same person that wrote the song Piggies. And George Harrison was certainly not a classical music composer. Okay, so it's stuff like this. Once you start to dig into the conspiracy and you start to understand who the players are, you can start to pick it apart. Okay, so going back to my premise, George did write Long, 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 which, by the way, I find to be a very plodding song, just my personal opinion. And Piggies was not written by George. He sang it, but the song, in my opinion, was written by Theodore Adorno. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go to the next slide and talk about things to look for that might take place because we're unraveling the mystery of the Beatles conspiracy. Okay, so things to look for, maybe some predictions. As I've mentioned before, the ticker tape parade is well underway and has been since 2009. So we're going to see a continued ramping up of Billy and Beatle news, merchandise, etc. As an example, the Revolver box set just came out, and he just released another book titled McCartney Legacies. So expect more of this type of activity to take place. I'm also expecting that there's going to be some image doctoring to fix Billy's eye, to ensure that more images are out there where his eyes are aligned. And of course, this is the result of Sally's discovery that Billy has an artificial eye in his right eye. He sees out of his left. And I do expect that there's going to be an effort to try to smooth that out, some damage control. And if I take a look to the slide on the right, this is a slide I had in my presentation going back to 2019 when I was talking about Billy's hallux extensus, which is where the big toe sticks up. So here we have an image of biological Paul McCartney, and he certainly did not have hallux extensus, yet on the right is a doctored image where his big toe on his right foot is sticking up. And we can also see it was a pretty poor job of doctoring. But nonetheless, an effort was made to doctor at least this image and put it out into the public domain. I'm also expecting that deepfake technology is on the horizon, and it will most likely be presented as newly found or lost footage of the lads recording in the studio. And this would be the result of my research, where I concluded that the Beatles did not write all their own music and did not play on all the recorded tracks. And in one presentation that I did a number of weeks ago titled Questioning the Official Narrative, I had put the challenge out there. And the challenge was this: show us genuine footage of the lads in the studio laying down the recorded tracks for the songs on their albums, because we don't have that. The closest we have is the Get Back sessions, and that was one of the selling points of Peter Jackson's documentary, that it's really the only footage we have where they're in a studio. And as I mentioned, the Get Back sessions did not prove anything. They were supposed to write 12 new songs within 2 weeks, play live, do a TV special, and none of that transpired. It wound up that they were there for 30 days and played 5 songs on a rooftop to no audience, and then released a subpar album, at least subpar by Beatles standards. So, it would not surprise me, let me just phrase it that way, if in the future, newly found or lost footage of the lads recording in the studio pops up. Okay, so I'm just throwing that out there. And then we have that date that is mentioned in memoirs, February 21st, 2023. It's the 63rd day of winter, so 6 plus 3 is 9, and 27 days left until spring, until renewal. And of course, 2 plus 7 is also 9. Now, I don't know what's going to happen on February 21st, 2023. Does Billy pass away? I don't know. Does Billy retire? Could be. I don't know. But it's only, about 3 months out? So we'll have to wait it out and see what happens. Okay, so let's move to the last slide, and let's talk a little bit about the comments policy. Okay, so let's talk about the comments policy. I've done this a few times before, but it's always good to cover it again. I have a lot of new subscribers, so hopefully you made it to the end of this video and you can take a listen. My channel is dedicated to my research and caters to critical thinkers, not sleepwalkers. Comments need to be on topic and value add. Comments where it's obvious the person did not watch the video will be deleted. Comments containing arrested developed behavior, for example, nastiness, belligerence, stupidity, trolling, etc., will also be deleted, and the commenter permanently banned from the channel. No self-promoting or advertising. You will be blocked. Comments which regurgitate the official narrative, that is the Cinderella story, as, quote, proof or evidence, will not be approved. I know the official story. You are not telling me anything I don't already know. And the official story, overall, is a lie. And using a lie to prove a lie is still a lie. And there's plenty of Beatle-related channels and sites to visit and to soothe one's mainstream and conditioned beliefs. In other words, don't hang out here. This channel is for critical thinkers. This channel is for people who think outside the box. If you're going to stay inside the box, then you don't belong here. Now, with regard to other Paul is dead theories that are outside of my research, I have discussed these other theories or these hypotheses or speculations, such as the twin theory, Halliday, Unwin, they all died, McCartney dying from heart disease. My channel is not an advertising vehicle or clearinghouse for every Paul is dead theory in existence. If you have a theory, build your own presence. No wagon hitching, which means no coattail riding on my work. We have to go back to the first bullet. My channel is dedicated to my research. I will talk about these other theories once in a while, but I'm not going to do it at the expense of my core work. Also, if your comment is not approved, it does not mean you're being censored. Why is that? Because everybody has the ability to create original content and present their work, their opinions, and their beliefs. Because you can't do it here doesn't mean you're being censored. You have the ability to put yourself out there, and that's on you to do that. And last but not least, 99% of all comments are approved. Okay? So that's it, my friends. That's this presentation. The comment section is open. You guys have a great day, and we will talk soon.
We'd like you, if you would, to sort of join in and clap your hands, you know, and stamp your feet.
I think you'll understand. Like, wow, the Beatles. Aren't they the swinging living end? You dig, chick?
I dig, Chuck.
That's one scene I gotta make.
Me too, Chuck.
Great, we'll make it together. Got the date?
March 14th and 15th.
Check, you got the date. I'll borrow wheels and we'll go, girl, go.
Crazy.
Let's give everybody this scam. For the first time, you'll see and hear the Beatles on closed-circuit big screen in a theater. Don't confuse this with home TV or anything you've heard or seen yet. This is the greatest. Don't miss it.